So this is the chapter 17 quiz. And the first question says, and by the way, this first part is a little bit wordy. I'm going to distill it for you, but let's read it first. Assuming constant costs in the neighborhood of their current levels of production. What does that mean? Well, we looked at these types of PPCs before and then said, but if we're just looking at this area right here, the opportunity cost for small changes is given by the slope of this line that's tangent to it. So that's what they say. In the neighborhood doesn't refer to a geographical area, but rather right in that area of the PPC where we put the line tangent to it. The exhibit shows the number of units of commodity X each country would have to forego to produce the additional units of commodity Y. Further, assume that the only input is labor and that it remains fully employed. The cost of the United States for producing an additional unit of Y is blank units of X. I would say that this is not the most helpful for you, but what you should notice is that this is the production possibility schedule, and you can plot this and make production possibilities curves. And the fact that we're assuming constant costs means we can just draw straight line PPCs. So what would this look like? For the US, we have the following, and Canada. Let's put commodity X on the x-axis and commodity Y on the y-axis. So if the United States uses all its resources, in this case labor, to produce X, it can produce how many? 24. And if instead it uses all its resources to produce Y, it can produce 4. And so then we connect these, and this is our PPC. It's not bowed out, and this is a simplifying assumption. Now, for this question, we don't have to do it for Canada. But just to be complete, we see that in Canada, they can produce 8 units of X or 2 units of Y. All right, so the question is, what is the cost to the United States of producing an additional unit of Y? Well, let's say that we're right here producing 24 units of X and 0 units of Y. And we move here where we're producing 1 unit of Y. So the question is, what number is right there? 18, right. And so how much X did we give up? 6. So that's the way that I would answer this. You could just calculate the opportunity cost as well and say the opportunity cost of producing 24X is 4Y. And so what does that mean? Well, if you're using all your resources to produce Y, that means you're not producing any X, right? And so by producing 24 units of Y, you give up the opportunity to produce 4 units of, I said that wrong. By producing, this should be X. Sorry, my sloppy handwriting is getting me in trouble. By producing 24 units of X, you give up the opportunity to produce 4 units of Y. And then to put this in the frame of what's the opportunity cost of producing 1 unit of X, just divide this by 24 and this by 24. So then you have the opportunity cost of producing 1X is 1/6 Y. But the question is about what's the opportunity cost of Y. And so the opportunity cost of 4Y is 24X, or in other words, the OC of 1Y is 6X. Moving on to question 2, I'm going to give you the answer and then explain why it's correct. Question 2, gains of trade are possible for 2 countries if they have different opportunity costs. So the right answer is A, and let me show you why this must be true. I've drawn 2 diagrams here with different numbers. So let's fill in this table of opportunity costs here on the right. So the opportunity cost of producing X in the US is what? Well, By producing 4 units of X, the US gives up the opportunity to produce 2 units of Y. Therefore, the opportunity cost of 1 unit of X is half a unit of Y. What about the opportunity cost of Y in the US? Well, by producing 2 units of Y, we give up the opportunity to produce 4 units of X. So by producing 1 unit of Y, we give up the opportunity to produce 2 units of X. And so you see that the opportunity cost is always just the reciprocal. Right? What about in Canada? By producing 1 unit of Y, we give up the opportunity to produce 2 units of X. So the opportunity cost of Y is 2 units of X. And therefore, because it must be the reciprocal, this is 1/2. So what do we notice? The US and Canada, in this example, have identical opportunity costs. Right? US has an absolute advantage in both. It can produce more of both. But it doesn't have a comparative advantage. Right? In order to have a comparative advantage in something, you have to have a lower opportunity cost. And so what this suggests is diversity is a good thing. Right? It's good for the countries to be different, because if they have different opportunity costs, they can specialize and trade. But here they can't. So let me just give you one example of why they can't trade. So normally we would say, okay, the countries specialize in whatever they have a comparative advantage in. But since the opportunity costs are equal, neither has the comparative advantage in anything. But let's just say the US specializes in X and Canada specializes in Y. So they completely specialize. They only produce these goods. Now let's imagine they're going to trade. The price of, so let's say they're going to trade X for Y. In order to, if US is going to produce Y, let's say it produces 1 unit of Y, then it gives up 2 units of X, right? So in other words, let's say the US without trade wanted to get some Y. So it produced 1 unit of Y. That would put us here, right? We have 1 unit of Y and 2 units of X. So the US wouldn't buy Y from Canada for any more than 2x. It would not pay more than 2x to get a unit of Y from Canada. And likewise, Canada won't give more than 2x, because if it wants to get some X, it has to give up, if it wants to get 2x, it has to give up 1Y. So the terms of trade have to be between the two countries' opportunity costs. In this case, has to be, the price of Y has to be between 2x and 2x. Well, what number is between 2x? They're the same number, right? So it has to be 2x. Okay, so the terms of trade are 2x for 1 unit of Y. So Canada goes from producing here, this red dot, it exports 1 unit of Y to the United States and gets 2 units of X. So it's here. Likewise, the US exports 2 units of X and gets 1 unit of Y. So we both wind up in these green dots now. Have these countries gained from trade? No. They could have wound up at the exact same spots by producing there themselves. They only gain from trade if they're to the right of the PPCs. And so again, this suggests that diversity is a good thing. If you have different opportunity costs, you can gain from trade by specializing in the production of the good in which you have a comparative advantage. But here, you don't have a comparative advantage in anything because your opportunity costs are the same, therefore you can't gain from trade. Okay, question 3. Opportunity cost reflected on a production possibilities curve is A, the cost of reducing the output of one good in order to increase the output of another. It's not a dollar cost, right? It's measured in terms of the other good. It's not independent of the slope of the curve. In fact, it is the slope of the curve, the absolute value. And it has nothing to do with demand and supply. Okay, moving on. So now that we've seen this type of problem before, we can just jump right in. Assuming constant costs, let's just get right to the question. The cost to country X of producing an additional tire is blank radios. So really this is saying, what is the opportunity cost of a tire in country X? And if you want, you can always create this table of opportunity costs. You don't have to fill it in completely for all questions, but it's good to get in the habit of setting this up so that you know how to approach these problems. Because you're almost certainly going to see a problem like this, right? So we would have country X and country Y. It's a little bit confusing because before we had US and Canada with good X and good Y, but now these are the names of the countries. And then we have tires and radios. So we're only concerned about country X. So for this part, at least, we can ignore the right-hand side. We can just ignore this. But you know, I put it there so you saw how to set it up for in the future if you need it. And then we only, in fact, care about the opportunity cost of a tire. So we really only need to fill in this box here. But let's draw the PPC anyway. Country X, if they produce only tires, they can get 40. If they produce only radios, they can get 20. So the OC of 40 tires is 20 radios. The opportunity cost of one tire is 0.5 radios. I just divided this by 40 and then this by 40. And so 1/2 is the answer. Question 4 is B. Question 5. If the executives of the U.S. silicon chip industry lobby Congress for protection on the grounds that foreign producers are selling silicon chips below production costs, they are using the dumping argument. B. Question 6. The absolute value of the slope of the PPC at any point, the answer is C, gives the quantity of the good of the vertical axis on the vertical axis that must be given up to produce an additional unit of good on the horizontal axis. Why is this right? Well, let me say why the others are wrong. D is wrong because it does not give the price of the good on the horizontal axis, right? Opportunity cost is always measured in terms of quantity of the other good. So D is not right. Found by dividing the horizontal change by a vertical change would be not rise over run, but run over rise. Not only that, it wouldn't give you the absolute value. So this is not right. And again, gives the price of the good. No, gives the quantity of the good. Question 7. Which of the following is true? Omega Land can produce more computers than Alpha Land. Well, Omega Land can produce, it looks like, 6 computers, whereas Alpha Land can produce 10 computers. So this is not true. Alpha Land is capable of producing more of both goods. Well, we already saw they're able to produce more computers. Can they produce more cars? Well, here we're talking about 10 versus 7. So yes, this is true. What about C? Trade is not possible since it would not be advantageous for Alpha Land. No, they have different opportunity costs, right? The slope of this line is not equal to the slope of this line. Because the opportunity costs differ, they can gain from trade. And trade will benefit both countries if they have different opportunity costs. Question 8. People participate in international trade because, I hope everyone got this, they're better off. At least in economic models, you know, you would not buy and import if it didn't make you better off, right? Question 9, assume that the U.S. imposes a quota on Italian shoes. Then the equilibrium price of shoes in the U.S. will most likely increase, right? Because you have supply and demand for shoes. Now, because there's a quota, the supply falls in the U.S. What about in Italy? Well, they also have a supply and demand for shoes. And what happens in Italy? The supply increases. because now fewer shoes are shipped to the US. So here the price rises, here the price falls. So the US, the price will most likely increase. In Italy, it'll most likely decrease. Last question. Another one of these tables. The question is about absolute advantage and comparative advantage. So let's first figure out which country has an absolute advantage. In tires, country X can produce more tires, and they can also produce more radios. So country X has an absolute advantage in both of them. Sometimes you have to look at absolute advantage in terms of output per worker. You see here they each have 10 workers. If these are ever different, then just divide. So you get 4 tires per workers versus 3 tires per workers. 2 radios per worker versus 1 radio per worker. Either way, country X has the absolute advantage. But if these are different, then, for example, if this is just 1 worker, then country Y has an absolute advantage in both. Okay, what about comparative advantage? Again, I suggest set up this table of opportunity costs. For country X and country Y, they can produce tires or radios. So, if country X, let's focus on country X, produces 40 tires, they give up the opportunity to produce 20 radios. So if they produce 1 tire, they give up their opportunity to produce 0.5 radios. So then you know that down here in this box it's going to be 2. It's the reciprocal. But let's just go through the explanation. If country X produces 20 radios, they give up the opportunity to produce 40 tires. So if country X produces 1 radio, they give up the opportunity to produce 2 tires. What about country Y? If they produce 30 tires, they give up the opportunity to produce 10 radios. So if they produce 1 tire, they give up the opportunity to produce 1/3 of a radio. I'm writing it as 0.33 to make decimal, we can compare it in terms of decimals. We could put it in fractions also, but whatever. Okay, and just for completeness, if country Y produces 10 radios, they give up the opportunity to produce 30 tires. So if they produce 1 radio, they give up the opportunity to produce 3 tires. So you have a comparative advantage in something if you have a lower opportunity cost of producing it. Who has a comparative advantage in tires? Country Y, because 0.3 is less than 0.5. And country X has a comparative advantage in radios because 2 is less than 3. Okay, so we're talking about country X. We already saw that it has an absolute advantage in both goods. So it's so it can't be C or D, right? Both of these have absolute advantage in both goods. But it has a comparative advantage in radios. So only B is the right answer.